With that, we come to the day-long deliberations on the G20. I would now like to invite Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO of the National Institute for Transforming India, to deliver his valedictory address, his closing keynote. Mr. Amitabh Kant, over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to thank the Observer Research Foundation for organizing this virtual roundtable on a very important subject at a very apt time. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused tremendous damage to the global economy, and India is no exception. In these times of an unprecedented crisis, the significance of G20 has grown considerably to fight the pandemic and pave the way for a resilient global economic recovery. G20 nations have deployed a massive $11 trillion so far to accelerate an equitable and sustainable economic recovery. The importance of G20 as the premier forum for international economic cooperation and global governance can be underscored by the fact that G20 members collectively represent around 80% of the world's economic output, 2/3 of the global population, and 3/4 of international trade. In the post-pandemic era, the world economic order is set for a recast with huge gaps between the performance of countries opening up. According to forecasts by the OECD, by end 2021, the US economy will be the same size as it was in 2019, but China will be 10% larger. Europe and Japan would languish below the pre-pandemic level of output and could do so for several years. From India's perspective, recovery in GDP, as evident from Q2 financial year 2021, is firmly on track and sets the foundation to regain our position as the fastest growing major economy next year, as projected by the IMF. As the pandemic reshapes the world economic order, G20 can act as the key platform for rethinking global economic governance. Among the key priorities, as highlighted by the Honorable Prime Minister at the G20 summit, will be reforming multilateral organizations to ensure better global governance for faster post-COVID recovery. Global growth has historically been driven by four factors: population growth, total factor productivity growth, trade growth, and debt growth. Population growth across the world has been slowing down, and some advanced economies are facing structural headwinds due to an aging population. Japan, for example, now has the highest dependency ratio of 67%. Relative to 1960, the share of global population above 65 has more than quadrupled, while the share of the working age population between years 15 and 64 has increased just 2.8 times. It is also important to note that relative to 1980, productivity has only risen by 1.3 times. Unless there are huge increases in productivity, a shrinking workforce and slowing productivity growth will drag the global GDP growth down. Since the global financial crisis, global trade as a percentage of GDP has fallen to 57.9% in 2019 from 60.7% in 2010. This has further impeded economic growth. Rising calls for protectionism and reshuffling of global chains might further increase the risk to global growth. With weak fundamentals of economic growth, global debt relative to GDP is high and rising, and the total global debt, both government and private sector, has surpassed 3% as 300% as major economies continue taking measures to finance spending on public health and economic stimulus packages amidst the COVID-19 pandemic and contractual global GDP. According to IMF projections October 2020, the gross government debt to GDP ratio for the world is projected to increase from 82.8% in 2019 to 103.2% in 2021. Advanced economies are expected to see significantly higher increase compared to emerging economies. Even though debt has played an increasingly important role in economic growth since the global financial crisis, excessive high levels of debt relative to GDP are dangerous. Interest rates across large OECD countries have been low and falling since the global financial crisis. Large debt accumulated in a low interest rate environment becomes unsustainable when interest rates rise materially. These levels of debt are only serviceable till they are supported by a similar pace of economic growth. With weakening fundamentals, economic growth acceleration faces headwinds in the coming years. It is highly unlikely that interest rates can be maintained at low or negative levels for an indefinite period. Thus, a deleveraging may occur in large OECD countries. This deleveraging is deflationary in its effect. It will increase the real value of debt burden, making debt servicing even more difficult, leading to bankruptcies, rising unemployment, and further hampering economic growth. Therefore, it will be crucial to ensure that the accumulated debt doesn't become unstable and the world returns on the path of fiscal prudence at the right time. The fragilities of the global order have been revealed quite starkly during the pandemic. Strategic dependence of global supply chain on just one economy for vital commodities poses huge risks for the global economic stability. While overall global exports and imports are much more diversified across countries today than they were 100 years ago, it is in some key sectors that one economy has almost 50% capacity and supply of the world. Post the global financial crisis, as mentioned earlier, global trade to GDP ratio has remained flat and growth is predominantly fueled by increasing debt. With such high levels of debt, we need multilateral institutions which could harness the power of global cooperation. Increasing global integration through trade and investment flows is needed to boost growth when debt has reached its limit, and for that, the world will need cooperation at an unprecedented level. The world has seen a lot of development and an extended period of peace for some decades now, and any temptation to be aggressive and looking more inwards rather than cooperating will perhaps be a huge loss for the entire global economy. A resilient post pandemic global economic growth is dependent on global trade and investment. Global trade and FDI flows have been estimated to decline tremendously in 2020. The world needs to be cautious given the accelerated protectionism due to the COVID pandemic. It is necessary to ensure that commitment to globalization is not replaced by turning inwards. Global economic governance has mostly been viewed from the perspective of having a unipolar or a bipolar world, but such a global order will be fraught with increasing tensions. We need ways to build a more cooperative global order where there are multiple economic centers of power with enough checks and balances that the system doesn't become fragile when it is required to remain strong. The old adage of Vasudev Kutumbakam remains relevant today more than ever, that the world is one family. India believes in this and has remained an integral part of the global supply chains and is working towards increasing its competitiveness globally. We also support diversifying the supply chains for a much safer global economic order than we have currently. We need a demand greater cooperation and ways to increase global integration through trade, investment, and knowledge transfers for a robust global economic recovery and sustainable growth thereafter. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the economic ramifications of COVID-19 have significant bearing on reshaping the world economic order. As countries weigh their external linkages and recalibrate development strategies, the global economic order needs a rethink. And G20 being a significant part of the global economy, it will play a crucial and a critical role in bringing that change. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kant, thank you very much for that valedictory address. We take note of the suggestions that you have made, including the drivers of GDP growth and how population, trade, and productivity and debt financing affects growth and global growth. We also take note of some of the issues you have raised regarding the fragility of the global economic system, the global supply chains, and why global economic governance remains important, including your comment that, as far as India is concerned, we will continue to work with the principle of Vasudev Kutumbakam, and that we will continue to engage with the world on global economic issues. So with that, I'd like to now bring this day-long conference to a close. I'd like to thank all the participants, the experts, the officials who have spoken, everybody who's registered and tuned in. I hope you got a chance to listen in and ask your questions. If not, the ORF platforms are always available for you to continue our debate. Please keep reading some of the articles that are being published on the G20, on geoeconomics, on the global economy and global economic governance issues. For that, you can visit the ORF website. For now, thank you very much and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Good night.